They laughed the first time they saw it. German tank officers in Tunisia pointed at photographs of the new American light tank, small, squat, barely armored, and dismissed it with a sneer. Ein Spielzeugpanzer, they called it. A toy tank. Something for parades, not war. Something a child might wind up and send across the floor. But they didn't yet understand what the Americans were building. They didn't understand the philosophy, the purpose, or the terrifying speed that was hidden beneath the Stuart's aluminum-like silhouette. They didn't understand that they were mocking the very thing that would soon outpace, outmaneuver, and outsmart them in two brutal campaigns, North Africa and Sicily. Because the M5 Stuart was not born to duel, it was born to run. A new kind of war, a new kind of tank. In 1941, the US Army looked at Europe and saw a battlefield that no longer belonged solely to heavy machines. The Germans had Panzer IVs and IIIs, yes, but they also had something far more dangerous, reconnaissance speed. Their armored cars, half-tracks, and motorcycle units scouted ahead, found weak points, and opened doors for the blitzkrieg. The US Army needed something that could answer that, something fast, something with reach, something a commander could send beyond the horizon and simply say, "Find my enemy." What emerged was the M5 Stuart light tank, a successor to the earlier M3, redesigned from the inside out. At first glance, the M5 looked unimpressive. It had thin armor. It had a 37mm gun that seemed tiny compared to German 50mm and 75mm cannons. It sat lower, sleeker, almost harmless. But beneath its turret was the secret. Two Cadillac V8 engines, linked through an automatic transmission smoother than anything the Germans had imagined for a tank. To a tank crew accustomed to clunky gears, grinding metal, and the constant threat of mechanical failure, the M5 was a revelation. It drove like a car. It accelerated like a dare. It could reverse, pivot, and sprint across open desert without choking in dust. And most importantly, it could reach 58 kilometers per hour, a speed so absurd for armored warfare that even many American commanders doubted the numbers. The US wasn't designing a panzer killer. It was designing a ghost, a tank that would appear, strike, and vanish before the enemy knew what happened. Engineers who believed in motion over muscle. The design philosophy behind the M5 was radical for its time. Engineers at Cadillac and Detroit's tank arsenals knew they were not building a tank for slugging matches. They were building a machine for reconnaissance, flanking maneuvers, pursuit operations, and exploitation. Why armor a scout like a fortress? Why weigh it down with a heavy gun that slowed the turret? Why build something destined to get stuck in mud, sand, or rock? Instead, they applied a different logic. If you cannot survive a hit, don't get a hit. If you cannot overpower the enemy, outrun him. If you cannot win a duel, refuse to fight one. It was almost the opposite of German armor doctrine, which emphasized thicker armor and heavier guns. To the Germans, weakness was physical, lack of steel, lack of size. To the Americans, weakness was doctrinal. Being slow meant being dead. The M5 proved that agility could be armor, that speed could be firepower, that mobility could be strategy. The first time Germans saw it. In late 1942, when the first M5 Stuarts rolled across North Africa, German tankers laughed. Reports from panzer units described them as leicht gepanzert, kaum eine Bedrohung, lightly armored, hardly a threat. German commanders believed they would crush these tanks effortlessly. To them, the Stuart was a flimsy aluminum box with a pop gun stuck on top. But then something unexpected happened. In the first clashes, near Tebessa and Sidi Bouzid, German tank crews encountered the M5 not as an opponent in a slugging match, but as a phantom. It darted across dunes before Panzer IV turrets could even swing toward it. It popped up on ridgelines, fired, and vanished behind cover. It slipped through ravines and wadis like a desert fox. It passed through soft sand that bogged down heavier tanks. It approached from angles no one defended. It cut supply lines and melted away. It appeared where no map said it should be. German tank commanders radioed furious questions. Where are they coming from? How are they moving so fast? Why can't we catch them? The answer was simple. Because the M5 wasn't challenged by the terrain. It devoured the terrain. Inside the M5, the heartbeat of speed. For crews inside the M5, the experience was unlike any armored vehicle of the time. The Cadillac engines purred instead of growled. The automatic transmission shifted smoothly instead of grinding teeth. The tank responded instantly to driver input, allowing quick bursts, evasive maneuvers, and sudden acceleration that turned ambushes into escapes. A veteran driver later said, "The M5 didn't feel like a tank. It felt like a beast straining at the leash." Crews learned something quickly. The gun was small, the armor was thin, but the tank itself was alive. It wanted to move. It wanted to run. And in the desert, movement was survival. A tank defined by philosophy, not firepower. German crews judged the M5 by what they could see, its size, its gun, its armor. But they could not see what mattered most, the doctrine behind it. The US built the M5 not to fight tanks, but to fight the map, to conquer distance, to outpace convoys, to scout before dawn, to strike supply lines, to guide Shermans into battle, to be everywhere at once. It wasn't built to win glory, it was built to win information. And information wins wars. The laughter that would not last. As 1943 approached, with North Africa turning into a proving ground for every Allied weapon, the M5 began to demonstrate exactly why dismissing it had been a mistake. The Germans had laughed. They would not laugh for long. Because soon, in the sands of Tunisia and the hills of Sicily, they would discover what the M5 truly was. Not a toy tank, not a joke, not a flimsy machine, but the one thing no panzer could ever afford to race, the tank they could not catch.
The desert should have belonged to the Germans. They had battled across Libya and Egypt for nearly 2 years before the Americans arrived. Rommel's Africa Corps, hardened by the sun, carved by wind and sand. Their Panzer IVs ruled the open dunes, their half-tracks roared along dry wadis, and their scouts skimmed across the terrain with uncanny skill. But in late 1942, something new appeared on the battlefield. Something small, something fast, something that moved with a confidence no one expected. The Germans had laughed at the M5 Stuart the first time they saw it in reconnaissance reports. But in North Africa, the laughter stopped. The M5 arrives in the desert, a machine at home in the heat. From the moment the M5 reached Tunisia, its crews knew they were driving a machine not intimidated by the desert, it thrived in it. Other tanks struggled constantly. Panzer IV transmissions overheated in the scorching sun. British Grants clogged their air filters with fine dust. Even the American Sherman choked when its engine inhaled too much sand. But the M5? The M5 breathed desert air as if it were made for it. Twin Cadillac V8s purred like low thunder and hardly broke a sweat. The automatic transmission shifted with buttery smoothness even while climbing dunes. The cooling system, refined, civilian-inspired, overbuilt, kept temperatures stable where German engines screamed and sputtered. One American driver in the 1st Armored Division recalled the moment he realized the truth. The desert wasn't our enemy, it was our highway. The M5 didn't just survive the desert, it owned it. First contact. A ghost on the dunes. Near Sidi Bou Zaid, the Africa Corps encountered the Stuart in combat for the first time. 3 Panzer IIIs crested a ridge, dust trailing behind them. Their commanders spotted movement, small shapes darting between rocks, kicking up thin plumes of sand. Through binoculars, they chuckled, Spielzeugpanzer, toy tanks. But their amusement turned to confusion when the M5s vanished, simply disappeared into a dip in the terrain. Moments later, they reappeared 600 meters away, not retreating, but flanking. Then they vanished again, then appeared on the opposite side, then behind, then on high ground, then gone again. German radios erupted with frantic calls, Sie bewegen sich zu schnell! They're moving too fast. It wasn't combat. It wasn't pursuit. It was a dance the panzer crews had never practiced and could not keep up with. Speed as a weapon. The M5 didn't win battles with its gun. It won with maneuver, with burst acceleration, with nimble pivots in lightning-fast repositioning. During the Battle of Kasserine Pass, M5s slipped through ravines so narrow a Panzer IV couldn't even turn its turret. They crossed soft, shifting sand at speeds that made German drivers curse their heavy suspensions. They darted around the flanks of German columns like wolves circling a lumbering bull. American crews discovered that the 37mm gun wasn't useless if used properly, if they closed the distance, if they struck the sides, if they fired while moving. One M5 commander described the Stuart mindset: hit fast, move faster, disappear fastest. At Kasserine, entire Africa Corps columns halted, not because they feared the M5's gun, but because they had no idea where the M5s were or what they were doing. And against German supply lines, speed mattered more than armor. Cutting the lifeline, the Stuart turns raider. The Africa Corps had a weakness: their logistics. Fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts traveled in convoys, long, fragile convoys snaking across the open sand. To a heavy tank, these convoys were hard to reach, but to an M5, they were prey. American light tank units began conducting slash raids, fast surgical strikes into enemy rear areas. They would appear out of nowhere, tear through a convoy with machine gun fire and 37mm shells, then disappear before German armored cars or Stukas could react. One famous raid near Gafsa saw 5 M5s destroy 14 trucks, 3 fuel tankers, 2 artillery tractors, and a radio command vehicle, all within under 4 minutes. By the time German reinforcements arrived, the Stuarts were gone, eaten by the desert. A furious German after-action report noted, "The American light tank strikes like mosquitoes, annoying, elusive, and impossible to kill." But they weren't mosquitoes. They were wolves, fast wolves with steel claws. The desert duel, a battle of nerves. Despite their mobility, M5 crews sometimes had to stand and fight. The most famous example took place near El Guitar, where a group of M5 Stuarts were surprised by Panzer IVs at close range. By all logic, the Americans should have died. Their armor was thin enough to be pierced by a German gun at over a mile away. Their 37mm could barely penetrate a Panzer IV except at perfect angles. But logic meant nothing when the M5 was allowed to move. The Stuarts scattered instantly, each tank darting in a different direction. The German commander hesitated, his sight picture shattered. He couldn't track all of them. The Americans weaved, darted, zigzagged, kicking up dust clouds as they rushed behind dunes. The Panzers fired, missed, fired again, missed again. Then the M5s did something insane. They counterattacked. They popped up from the flank at full speed and fired point-blank at the weaker side armor of the lead Panzer. The first shot missed. The second hit. The third penetrated. The Panzer erupted in smoke. The remaining German tanks backed off, furious and stunned. A tank they mocked just outplayed them in open combat. What German crews learned? Too late. After repeated clashes, the Germans made a grudging admission. The American light tank is not a toy. It is a reconnaissance devil. They began assigning faster vehicles to pursue Stuarts. They ordered artillery to fire preemptively on likely Stuart routes. They tried using aircraft to chase them down. None of it worked. The M5 could outrun everything except a plane, and even then it could weave through ground cover too quickly to track. One German tank commander wrote in his diary after Tunisia, "We never caught one. Never. They were gone before we turned our turrets." The desert had become the M5's arena, a place where its weaknesses vanished and its strengths became undeniable. North Africa ends, the legend begins. When Rommel retreated from Tunisia, many American tanks were battered, scarred, or burned. But the M5 Stuarts that survived carried new reputations. They were no longer toy tanks. They were the fastest machines in the desert, the first vehicles into enemy territory, the eyes and ears of the Allied advance. And as the campaign moved across the Mediterranean towards Sicily, the Germans braced themselves. They knew the little tank with the big engines wasn't finished. It was only getting started.
The Germans expected the M5 to shine on flat desert sand, but they never imagined it would dominate the rocky hills, twisting passes, and narrow goat trails of Sicily. When the Allied invasion began in July 1943, the terrain was supposed to punish fast vehicles. It was a land of steep ridges, stone terraces, switchback roads, and sudden ravines carved by centuries of wind. Panzer IVs and Tiger Is crawled across the island like exhausted beasts, their engines straining on every incline, the tracks grinding helplessly on loose gravel. Yet the M5 Stuart, the tank German crews once mocked as a toy, became the fastest, most unpredictable machine on the island, slipping between ridgelines, racing along mountain roads, appearing in valleys where no one believed a tank could possibly fit. For the first time, German soldiers saw something that unnerved them more than the tank itself, the grin on the faces of Stuart drivers who treated the mountain roads like racetracks. Sicily became a playground for the M5, and its legend grew in every village it passed through. The first shock came near Gela, where German and Italian armored units attempted to counterattack the beachhead. As Panzer IVs lumbered forward, American infantry suddenly saw M5s burst through olive groves, engines roaring, kicking dust into the air as they barreled down slopes the Germans refused to descend. A German officer later wrote that the Stuarts came from nowhere, like goats with engines. The Americans used the terrain as a weapon. Instead of charging frontally at German armor, M5s raced ahead and seized high ground, then radioed the positions of panzers below. When Italian M1340s attempted to climb after them, the Stuarts simply backed up the hill at speeds the heavier tanks couldn't match. In one engagement near Nishemi, 3 M5s lured a column of German armored cars into a tight pass. The Americans sprinted through the rocks, disappeared around a bend, and then reappeared behind the enemy line, firing into their engines before slipping away again. The ambush lasted less than 90 seconds. The escape took even less. German survivors described the Stuarts as phantoms, faster in the mountains than armored cars were on pavement. The campaign also proved one of the Stuarts' strangest advantages, its transmission. While Panzer gearboxes screamed and overheated trying to shift on steep grades, the Stuart's Cadillac automatic transmission handled the terrain with eerie smoothness. Drivers could weave through hairpin turns without losing speed. They could brake, pivot, and accelerate again in seconds. It wasn't just a tank, it was a steel athlete stretching its legs across Sicily's ridgelines. One crewman recalled racing a Panzer IV up a serpentine road near San Stefano. "He tried to catch us," the driver said, "but his engine growled like it hated the hill. Ours sang." The M5 vanished over the crest long before the German tank even reached the halfway point. Infantrymen advancing behind the Stuarts marveled at the pace of the little tanks. They were always ahead, spotting snipers, clearing roadblocks, racing into towns to cut retreating German units off. In the hills above Agrigento, a platoon of M5s charged along an abandoned mule trail that commanders believed impassable.
The Stuarts climbed it anyway, 3 miles of loose shale, tight turns, and sheer drops. They emerged behind a German artillery battery, surprising the gunners so completely that several dropped their shells and fled on foot. The Americans captured 2 88mm guns without firing a shot. A German officer later admitted they had considered the ridge tank-proof. The M5 have disproved that in minutes. Another moment that became legendary occurred near Troina, where German paratroopers held a mountain town with stubborn defiance. Sherman tanks struggled to climb the narrow road leading into the valley, their engines overheating in the summer heat. The Stuarts, however, zipped ahead, taking an alternate goat path spotted by a Sicilian civilian. The path was so narrow that each M5 had inches to spare. Branches scraped the hulls, rock dust coated the vents, and any misstep would have sent them tumbling hundreds of feet. But the Stuarts made it through and burst onto the high ground behind Troina, firing into German positions and forcing one of the most heavily defended towns in Sicily to retreat more quickly than anticipated. One German major wrote bitterly after the battle, "We do not fear the American light tank for its gun. We fear it because it appears where no tank should be." The speed of the Stuarts didn't just help offensively, it saved lives. During the retreat towards Messina, German rearguard units attempted several ambushes on narrow mountain roads, but Stuarts outran them every time. Panzer IVs tried to give chase, only to stall on inclines or lose traction entirely. German crews listened in frustration as the sound of Cadillac engines faded into the distance. Even Tiger tanks, which terrified infantry, were helpless in mountain combat. Their heavy frames broke stone walls, their engines overheated, and their turrets struggled to traverse on uneven ground. Meanwhile, the M5 climbed slopes, hugged ridges, darted around obstacles, and completed recon loops before the Germans even finished turning their engines over. By the time the Axis evacuated Sicily in August 1943, they'd learned something brutally simple. The M5 was not a toy. It was a vehicle that obeyed no limits, terrain, distance, or expectation. In the desert, it was fast. In Sicily, it was untouchable. The Germans had mocked it, but on that island of cliffs and stone, the M5 proved the truth. Speed is a weapon, and in the right hands, it is the deadliest of all.
Everyone who looked at the M5 Stuart on paper reached the same conclusion. It was never supposed to survive a battlefield dominated by Panzer IVs, Stugs, and eventually Tigers. Its armor was thin enough that a German 50mm could punch through it from over a kilometer away. Its 37mm guns struggled to penetrate anything but the weak spots of enemy armor. Its silhouette was small, but not invisible. By every traditional measure of armored warfare, the M5 should have been a casualty, not a contender. Yet, again and again, in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and the early stages of France, the M5 didn't just survive, it thrived. And the reason was simple. Its survival came not from what it carried, but from how it moved. The M5 was a paradox, a tank built like prey, but driven like a predator. It wasn't the thickest or strongest or deadliest. It was the tank that rewrote the rules of staying alive. The Germans learned early that shooting at a Stuart was not the same as hitting one. A Panzer IV rotating its turret toward an M5 often found nothing but a dust cloud by the time it finished aiming. A Tiger trying to ambush a Stuart learned that the M5 could reverse downhill faster than most German tanks could accelerate forward. The Stuart didn't fight duels, it refused duels. A Stuart's greatest weapon was the moment the driver slammed the throttle, the V8s roared in unison, and the tank launched itself across terrain like a metal hornet. Nothing in the German arsenal could mimic that burst of acceleration. The Tiger was a fortress, the M5 was a spark. The Americans knew exactly what they were doing. Light tank crews were some of the youngest soldiers in the entire armored force, reckless, fast-thinking, nerves of steel. They called themselves tumbleweeds, blown across the battlefield by speed and instinct. Their doctrine reflected that spirit. Never stop moving, never present a target, never fight fair. If a panzer spotted them, they disappeared. If artillery chased them, they outran the shells. If infantry ambushed them, they vanished behind terrain before the second volley. They learned that surviving wasn't about strength, it was about tempo. One story from the Italian campaign captured this perfectly. Near Salerno, a Tiger tank emerged from the woods and fired at a column of Stuart tanks. The first shot destroyed the trailing vehicle instantly. The others scattered as the Tiger's turret swung toward them. But the M5s didn't freeze or panic. They attacked the hill behind them. Drivers floored the throttle, engines screaming as they climbed a slope so steep the German crews assumed it was impassable. Dust shot into the air. Tracks clawed at loose rock. The Tiger commander hesitated. He couldn't follow. Before the Tiger could reposition, two Stuarts crested the hill behind it. They fired into its engine deck, then vanished again before the Tiger's turret could swing around. American infantry who witnessed the scene swore the M5s were laughing at gravity. Even in deadly moments, the M5 danced on the edge of disaster with a confidence no other tank could match. Its light weight meant it could cross bridges that would collapse under German armor. It could ford streams too shallow for a Panzer IV to risk. It could barrel through vineyards, orchard rows, and narrow village streets without getting wedged or bogged down. In the thick woods of Italy and the foothills leading to Rome, the M5 seemed to multiply. German patrols reported half a dozen light tanks, when in reality there were only two, racing back and forth across ridgelines faster than the Germans could track them. Surviving wasn't just mechanical, it was psychological. M5 crews learned how to weaponize fear. They used tree lines as ambush positions, they fired smoke rounds to confuse German gunners, they turned off their engines and coasted downhill silently to reposition. They would ghost enemy formations, appearing briefly on one flank, only to reappear minutes later behind them. German tank commanders, unable to keep up with the tempo, often assumed they were fighting a larger armored force. And when they did have to fight, the M5 crews fought dirty, because dirty fighting was the only way they lived. They fired at vision slits, they aimed at tracks, transmission housings, antenna mounts. They didn't try to kill panzers, they tried to cripple them, distract them, blind them. A disabled tank was as good as a dead one, especially if it blocked a road or stalled an assault. One veteran described the Stuarts' combat role this way. We were the knife fighters, the Shermans were the boxers, the tank destroyers were the big hitters, but us, we were the ones who slipped behind the enemy before they even knew they were in a fight. The M5 crews knew they were vulnerable. Every time they climbed inside, they accepted that one lucky German shot could turn the hull into a coffin. But instead of fear, they cultivated something else: rhythm. The rhythm of combat driving, the rhythm of speed, the rhythm of engines synced like a heartbeat. This rhythm became their armor and their legacy. In dossiers captured after Tunisia and Sicily, German analysts made a quiet admission buried deep in their reports. The American light tank is not to be underestimated. It does not fight as our tanks fight. It refuses battle on our terms. That was the M5's secret. It broke every rule German armor had been built upon. It survived by creating a new kind of warfare, one where velocity meant life, maneuver meant dominance, and courage meant trusting an aluminum-sized tank to do things no panzer would ever dare attempt. By the time the Americans prepared for the next stage of the war, the M5 Stuart was no longer mocked. It was feared. It was respected. It was understood, not as a toy, but as the tank that refused to die. And its speed, that unstoppable, unbelievable, terrain-shattering speed, was about to define its legacy forever. By the time the M5 Stuart rolled out of the mountains of Sicily and into the broader war in Italy and France, its reputation had transformed completely. What had begun as a tank mocked for its thin armor and tiny gun had become one of the most indispensable machines in the U.S. armored doctrine. The tank that moved faster, saw farther, and survived longer than anyone ever expected. It was no longer the toy tank of German jokes. It was the tank that commanders trusted when they needed eyes ahead of the line. The tank infantry cheered when it arrived at their flanks. The tank that seemed to exist in two places at once. Its legacy wasn't written in duels won or armored kills. It was written in the roads it opened, the ambushes it avoided, and the battles it accelerated. The Stuart had become the heartbeat of American maneuver warfare. Its first legacy lay in reconnaissance. Before the M5, scouting often meant sending armored cars or even infantry patrols ahead of the main force. These methods were slow, fragile, and easily ambushed.
But the M5 changed everything. Its combination of speed, reliability, and off-road capability made it the perfect armored scout. It could crest a ridge, scan a valley, and disappear before German artillery even calculated the range. When the 1st Armored Division advanced across Italy, the M5s often led the charge, not as blunt instruments, but as pathfinders. They found minefields before infantry walked into them. They exposed camouflaged anti-tank guns before Shermans rolled into the kill zone. They chased down German dispatch riders, broke up convoys, and forced enemy formations to reposition. Entire regiments began timing their movements according to the tempo set by the M5s. One American officer wrote in his after-action report, "We did not move the Stuarts into position. The Stuarts moved the battle for us." Their second legacy came from the chaos they sowed in enemy ranks. The Germans were used to a certain style of reconnaissance, measured, cautious, predictable. The M5 ignored all of that. It was unpredictable by design. A German battalion might see an M5 on their right flank in the morning and then find another behind them by noon. These appearances weren't coincidences. They were calculated penetrations by crews who understood that speed could confuse the enemy more completely than firepower ever could. In France, during the breakout from Normandy, M5s raced ahead of the main columns, slipping through hedgerows and lanes before German defenders could shift their forces. Several times, Stuarts cut telephone lines, disabled command cars, and even overran lightly defended headquarters before vanishing again. Panzer commanders started deploying extra patrols solely to hunt the M5s, but this only slowed their operational tempo further. The Stuarts' greatest kill was not steel, it was time. It eroded German reaction time until their defenses cracked. The third legacy of the M5 was its psychological impact on the Allies themselves. Infantry units loved the Stuart. To foot soldiers pinned by machine gun nests or uncertain about the next bend in the road, the sight of an M5 racing ahead meant safety. Stuart crews often took risks that heavy tank commanders would never accept, darting forward to draw fire, exposing themselves to spot ambushes, or cutting sideways across terrain to diagnose enemy intentions. They were the armored equivalent of cavalry outriders, and they revived something ancient in warfare, the belief that fast, fearless scouts could change the outcome of a battle. Many infantrymen later said that the M5 felt alive, not because of its steel, but because of the men who drove it. Young, energetic crews, often barely 20 years old, embraced the Stuart's personality. They joked that the tank felt like a sports car. They knew every vibration of the engine, every nuance of the transmission, every inch of the tracks. They could listen to the sound of the V8s and tell whether they needed more throttle or whether the oil was running hot. They treated their tanks like teammates, not tools, and the battlefield responded. The fourth legacy appeared after the war, when military historians began studying why American armored divisions moved so fast across Europe. The answer was always the same: maneuver warfare. And maneuver warfare depended on reconnaissance. And reconnaissance depended on one tank, the M5. Without its speed, the breakthroughs in Italy would have stalled. Without its scouting, the hedgerows of Normandy would have swallowed whole battalions. Without its constant harassment of German logistics, the retreat from Sicily would have been slower, bloodier, costlier. Even German analysts eventually admitted the truth. In a captured report from 1943, one Panzer regiment wrote, "The American light tank is not used as we use ours. It is used to see everything. It is used to be everywhere." That single sentence defined the Stuarts' place in history. But perhaps the greatest legacy of the M5 lies not in books or reports, but in the memories of the men who rode inside it. Veterans spoke of the Stuart the way sailors spoke of certain ships, a mixture of fear, admiration, and affection. They remembered the dust storms in Tunisia when their tank carved through dunes like a blade. They remembered racing Italian switchbacks with tires squealing and tracks scraping against stone. They remembered outrunning German artillery barrages because speed was our armor. They slipped behind enemy positions, hearts pounding, watching shadows in the trees as their engines idled quietly. They remembered every near miss, every escape,
every moment when the Stuart saved them not by being strong, but by being fast. One driver decades after the war touched the restored hull of an M5 at a museum and whispered, "You kept us alive because you never let them catch us." And that is the story of the M5 Stuart. Not a tank of brute force, not a machine of overwhelming firepower, but a tank that defied the expectations of friend and foe alike. A tank that survived because it broke every rule. A tank that outpaced death itself. The Germans laughed at it only once. After North Africa, after Sicily, after Italy and France, after chasing it across mountains and valleys and roads where no tank should have gone, they never laughed again. Because then they knew the truth. The Stuart wasn't a toy. It was the tank that outran an army, the unstoppable scout, the ghost of the battlefield.